I'm delighted today to be joined by Adam Higinbotam, who has written a terrific book, Midnight in Chernobyl. So, Adam, what got you interested in this topic in the first place? To me, it feels like almost yesterday, but for some people we were talking about it, it happened before they were born. How did you first come to the story?
In the kind of lamest journalistic way possible, which was that in 2005, I was looking for the subject of another non-fiction narrative story for a magazine story. And I just wasn't coming up with anything. So I resorted to the most pathetic, scandalous methodology of a journalist, which is to look for an anniversary. And so I was like, well, we're in 2000. I'm looking at planning ahead, 2006. Let's go back to 1996. And so I'm looking at the Wikipedia calendar. There's not much going on in 1996. The world's largely, it's pretty good, 1996. But then I go back to 1986, and it's festooned with massive global events. And I get to Chernobyl, and I realize that really nobody has written anything significant about this since immediately after it happened. Right. So I persuaded my editors to let me go to Kiev and Moscow to start tracking down eyewitnesses to what happened. Just so that I could write a short piece, like a 5,000-word magazine story, just reconstructing the events of that night of April the 26th. But literally, as soon as I started talking to the first person I spoke to, I realized that there was a much wider story to be told. And what I had read up to that point was... Who was
the first person you talked to?
Alexander Yevchenko.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Who is someone who becomes, eventually became one of the main protagonists of the story. And to begin with, I was kind of astounded that he was still alive to tell me about the things that he'd seen, because his experience was so remarkable. And then what he began telling me about, I just thought, well, if there's even two more of these people, then there's enough material for a book. And the more people I spoke to, the more incredible and sort of epic in scope the story became.
One of the other protagonists, Viktor Brukhanov, was the plant manager, more or less, and was charged.
Yeah, he was in charge of everything.
Building everything, building the town. Tell a little bit about what his job was to sort of construct this city and this.
Well, Brukhanov was really the person that after I'd done some research, I decided was the person around whom I wanted to build the whole narrative, because he begins the story as this ambitious, bright-eyed, 34-year-old true believer standing with a group of men in a snow-covered field in Western Ukraine, being told that what he's going to do with this field is build what will become the largest nuclear power station in the world. And this is in 1970. And along the way, he learns the true nature of his job. And almost as soon as he begins, within 2 years of being given this job, he actually tries to quit because he realizes how impossible it is. That he's being presented with these crazy deadlines. He has no resources. It starts with him sitting on a hotel bed with a slide rule in one hand and a list of requirements in the other. And he's got to do it all on his own. And eventually, he gradually becomes more and more disillusioned. They won't, of course, let him quit. He's employed by the Communist Party. Right. They're not going to let him just tear up his work orders and walk away. And he gradually realizes that in order to make things work, he has to cut corners and bend the rules and even kind of embezzle money from one project in order to pay for another. And really the story is the story of his kind of rise and downfall.
Yeah. Now, the town, on the one hand, there's this huge industrial complex he's building, but the town to me was a revelation. For those of us who grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, we picture some of these Soviet cities as kind of soulless and industrial, but it's actually quite a lovely community that was built up, and with a lot of well-educated, highly educated nuclear engineers and their families living right next to this plant. So talk a little bit about the vision, the Soviet vision of this industrial city.
Well, I was exactly the same as you, because I was 17 when the accident happened. And I had the same perception of life in the Soviet Union, that it was this kind of grim experience with these kind of monolithic tower blocks marching off to the horizon, right, and everybody living these benighted lives. But it became clear that Pripyat, the name of this
yeah,
atom grad that was built for the workers of the plant and their families, was a really wonderful place to live. It was built beside this river in this kind of sylvan environment in rural Ukraine. And they had, white sand beaches beside the river where they could go swimming. There was boating. The place was fantastically well resourced because they wanted to attract skilled nuclear workers from around the USSR. So they built these really nice apartment buildings, and they laid on supermarkets where you could buy things that you just couldn't buy in even big cities in the Soviet Union. The one thing that people remarked on was that you could buy fresh tomatoes, which in the USSR at the time was a delicacy.
Right.
And there was
French perfume. And,
French perfume, Austrian furniture. But they had a yacht club. They had a scuba club. It was a really, to be fair, if you visited from Kansas in 1986, you wouldn't necessarily think that it was that great.
But by the standards
by
of the
Soviet
Soviet
standards,
Union,
it was a fantastic place to live. So, what became clear as I was reporting it was that this conception that people in the West had, that the victims of the Chernobyl accident were people whose lives were grim beforehand and were then kind of grim but with radioactivity afterwards, that was totally untrue. They lost an enormous amount as a result of this accident.
So describe the night and what went wrong. They're set in April, was it 25th, 1986. They're ready to do a safety test, and they're in the control room, and I guess the safety test is overdue. Explain what happens.
Well, the safety test was almost 3 years overdue because it was supposed to have been conducted on the reactor before it even came online for commercial operation. Mm-hmm. And the thing was that it was a test on this rundown system, which was designed to keep cooling water circulating through the reactor in the case of a power cut. So to head off a meltdown, ironically, in the wake of subsequent events. But it could only really be conducted in the case of a routine maintenance shutdown. So they had this very narrow window of opportunity to conduct it. And they were determined to go ahead because they tried this test a couple of times before on other reactors in the complex, and it hadn't worked on either occasion. So this time, they'd modified this equipment, and they were determined it was going to go ahead. But then what happened is that the reactor operator who took over on the midnight shift, when he assumed control of the reactor, made a mistake. And so the reactor power began heading towards zero and hovered just above zero for several minutes. Now, at this point, the regulations stipulated that what you should do is just shut down the reactor. So there'd be no test. Shut it down, maintenance, all of that would go on as normal, but they wouldn't be able to do this test. But the deputy chief engineer of the plant, who was in charge of overseeing the test, was determined that the test should go ahead. Mm-hmm. So in contravention of the regulations and over the opposition of the operators themselves, he insisted they bring the reactor up to power. Now, in order to do this, they had to take out all of these control rods that would otherwise reduce reactor power. And there were many, many design deficiencies in the RBMK model of reactor that they were using. And one of them lay in the control rods and meant that under certain circumstances, when you use these rods to shut the reactor down, for a very brief period, instead of reducing reactivity in the core, it could increase it. So it was a design defect, as if you had a car where you wired the brakes and the accelerator pedal in reverse. So you stamp on the brakes, and instead of slowing down, the car suddenly speeds up. Now, what happened is that when they began withdrawing these rods in order to go ahead with the test, they put the reactor into a state of extreme instability. And from that point onwards, this is around 1 o'clock in the morning, a colossal accident was almost inevitable, and the reactor was essentially in the same state as a pistol with a hammer cocked. And all it needed was for someone to pull the trigger, in this case by reintroducing these emergency control rods, and there will be a cataclysmic accident, and that's what happened.
That's what happened. So was it, you said it was inevitable at that point, but was it in some level inevitable anyway? There's always some element of human error in these big industrial accidents, or you talked a little bit about Night to Remember, the story of the Titanic, but at some level, was this inevitable given the design and the flaws and the corner cutting that went on?
Well, what all of these accidents, like the 737 MAX, the Challenger accident, like the Titanic, they all have in common is that they're made up of this long chain of events. And each link in the chain will not necessarily on its own cause a disaster. But if the circumstances line up in just the wrong way, the confluence of events is joined together, and then that results in an accident. And in that sense, all of these things were all present in the design and the way in which the workers at the plant were accustomed to working. And certainly in the analysis that was shown to the Politburo in July '86 afterwards, you know, Nikolai Ryzhkov, who at that time was the Prime Minister of the USSR, you know, explicitly said, well, this accident was going to happen somewhere at one of these RBMK plants somewhere in the Soviet Union. If it hadn't been here, it would have been somewhere else.
Yeah. So, although the designer disagreed, he said, you know, if someone drives off the road, it's not the car's fault. So there's a debate, but he was a little invested in a tiny bit in the outcome. One of the obviously the response, they knew something was going on immediately, and the response was quick, if also flawed, but
chaotic.
Chaotic, yeah. Describe a little bit how the immediate response, not the longer term response, played out, and what went wrong there.
Well, initially, you know, the guys in the plant, the engineers and the operators themselves did everything they could to try and prevent the accident becoming worse. Right. Because after the explosion, you'd got oil spewing all over the place out of broken pipes. You had hydrogen was used as a coolant in the turbine generators. So if that had caught fire, there would have been another further explosion. Firefighters were deployed principally to stop the fires that had started from debris thrown out of the reactor explosion that had landed on the roofs of adjacent reactor buildings from spreading the fire further down the plant, because there were 3 reactors that continued running after the explosion took place. So they were terrified initially that the fire was going to spread to these other 3 reactors, and then you'd have just this even more unimaginable catastrophe on your hands. But what took place at an administrative level was something that was very common in the Soviet Union, which is people just tried to minimize the true scale of the catastrophe. So all that morning, you've got party officials and the head of the plant basically saying, no, there's been an explosion and there is a fire, but we're putting the fire out. Radiation, we're not sure about that. And they're sending these messages out to people. They're saying that are just telling people really what they want to hear, which is, yes, there's a fire, there's been a building collapse. We're not quite sure what's going on, but don't worry, it's under control. But at the same time, you've got, on some level, you have a kind of psychological breakdown, I think, takes place in the minds of certain people, where they're simply unprepared to believe the evidence of their own eyes. Yeah. So you have people looking at graphite, which has clearly come out of the core of the reactor, lying around on the ground outside the plant, and saying, well, this is obviously from the new reactor that we're building up the street, and this is just, you know, this is construction debris. Right.
It's kind of remarkable, though, at some level, that they didn't all just run away, because they were trained and they knew. I mean, there's some real heroism, and you get into that the firefighters rushing to the scene. I mean, they knew the consequences. Most of them were engineers and understood it. Yeah. And yet, almost everyone stayed on the scene. And
I mean, some people did actually run away and were subsequently dismissed from the Communist Party for doing so. Right. But almost everyone.
It might have been a good trade-off, though.
Arguably, yes.
You know, it's hard. It's hard to picture if you weren't around at that time, or if you haven't spent time in some of these big industrial plants. I happen to have visited a bunch of them in the Soviet Union, but just how much pride there was in the industrial might and the nuclear might of the Soviet Union. And so, how did that affect the leaders in Moscow when they began to hear about this, and how to color their response?
Well, the messaging was really very much conditioned by that, and the fact that both within the Soviet Union and externally, they had to subscribe to this notion that the Soviet Union led the world in high technology. So, you know, whenever there was an accident of any kind or anything that would throw Soviet technology or prestige into disrepute, they would do the same thing. They would take what was called the traditional approach, where they would downplay, they'd initially deny, and then they would release a very limited amount of information. And they would just try and keep as much information from the public as possible. So that's exactly what happened in this case. You know, initially they simply denied that anything had happened. They sealed off Pripyat to prevent information getting out about what had happened. They didn't want, you know, there were 50,000 people in the town. They didn't want these people spreading across the Soviet Union talking about this terrible disaster that had happened. And that initially, when they began receiving inquiries from abroad, they just said that they didn't know anything about what they were talking about. So the one thing that they couldn't conceal, of course, was the spread of radiation. So the word began to get out because radiation from the accident was detected inside a nuclear plant.
Yes,
Sweden.
No, that's a great story. There's this Swede who has, well, I guess he's British and Swedish, but he has a very un-Swedish name.
Cliff Robinson.
Cliff Robinson, yeah. I kept saying, is he really Swedish? But he's sort of testing the workers coming into the Swedish plant. He can't understand what's going on. So what happens there?
Yeah, what happened is he would always arrive very early at work. So he was one of the first person on the morning shift to arrive at work. And he was having coffee in the coffee room and then went to clean his teeth and then went through the radiation monitor to go to work into the plant. And that set off the radiation monitor. And of course, he thought to himself, well, this is crazy. This can't be right because I haven't been in the plant. I can't be contaminated with the radiation from our reactors because I've just been in the coffee room. There's no radiation in the coffee room. So he and the dosimetrist from the plant just decide that the machine must be miscalibrated and they'll deal with it later. So Cliff goes to work and he happens to work in the radiation monitoring lab upstairs. And he goes to work and he starts on his usual day of monitoring around inside the plant. And then like an hour later, he comes, because the Swedes are very keen on coffee breaks, so he has fika. And he comes back downstairs to make another cup of coffee in the break room. But now he sees there's this huge line of other workers, all of them arriving at work and all of them setting off the radiation alarm. So then he's like, he thinks that something's, you know...
It's a logical puzzle, right?
Really. But they've already had problems with the reactor at this plant, Forsmark. So their initial assumption is obviously that there must be some leak from inside the plant. And he takes a shoe off one of these guys and puts it in a plastic bag and takes it up to the lab and starts testing it. And he just kind of sits down and he knows how these things go. So he's going to wait 5 minutes to see what the results are. But actually what happens is the results come back like immediately and it displays this kind of terrifying array of radionuclides, none of which are present inside the reactor at Forsmark. And at this point, he begins to realize that something really terrible has happened somewhere else.
So one of the consequences of the Soviet Union not allowing much information out is that the rumor mill gets going and people start writing these stories ill-informed because they don't have any real information with these huge death counts.
Well, when you say people, you mean Western correspondents
Western journalism.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Journalists, right. Yeah.
Because journalists at the time, you know, foreign correspondents in Moscow were not permitted to leave Moscow without clearance from the government. Right. So they get wind of the fact that something has happened because the Soviets finally, you know, on Monday evening acknowledge that there's been an incident at the Chernobyl plant, but they don't even say when it happened. They don't mention any radiation having been released. But it's clear that the fact that they've announced this at all on the evening news means that something pretty bad has happened. So these Western correspondents in Moscow start trying to work all of the sources that they can. And this one reporter who's only recently arrived in the country has previously met like this Ukrainian woman on Red Square who he's like conducted a brief vox pop interview with. So he phones her up. And other people have subsequently suggested that this was on account of his bad Russian. But he understands her to say that she's heard that 15,000 people have been killed almost immediately in this accident that's taken place at Chernobyl, and their bodies have been buried in a nuclear waste dump somewhere in Ukraine. And this story is then published in the New York Post a couple of days later. And, you know, and then that figure is repeated several times on the evening news here. So, and from this point onwards, you know, you speak to people today and they still think... I
honestly thought I was shocked. We could talk a little bit about that. But how many people actually died? I mean, just for the... I was at the moment.
Well, at the moment, one person. Right. One person died in the initial explosion and then another succumbed to burns within 6 hours of the explosion.
Right.
But
the aftermath was
right,
much more severe.
So one person.
Obviously, the long-term medical impact was pretty dramatic, in part because they wouldn't acknowledge what was going on, and they didn't do some precautionary measures at the time, evacuations and the like. And so, I mean, eventually they do a pretty comprehensive and dramatic intervention. A little late, but describe a little bit both the effort to kind of contain the accident and evacuate the area.
Well, as I said, they waited to evacuate Pripyat because they thought it would look bad, really. Mm-hmm. And they had enough sort of cooperative optimists on the staff of the government commission that arrived to take control. Doctors and scientists who would say, well, maybe the wind will change direction. And, we've had accidents before and we didn't evacuate the population then. Mm-hmm. There's probably no need to do it. And eventually, they did it because they realized they didn't have any choice. Right. So then on Sunday afternoon, they began an evacuation, which is an indication really of one of the upsides of having a centrally planned economy, because they managed to get 27,500 people out of that town in less than 4 hours. But then, simultaneously with this, as the initial chaos of the misreporting of what was going on was replaced by a sort of dawning realization of how big the problem was, right. They realized that they'd got this nuclear reactor that was on fire. So they had this huge reactor vessel was filled with burning graphite, with thousands of tons of burning graphite, right, that was billowing this column of radioactive material into the atmosphere. And they didn't really know how they were going to put it out. So
they tried a lot of creative solutions. I mean, the creativity and ingenuity of both the armed forces and the engineers was pretty stunning, and just their willingness to, not that they always had a choice, but to try.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of genuine heroism among right. the scientists and the military personnel who went in to try and stop this from happening. So they brought in helicopter crews to drop sand on the reactor from overhead, right, in order to try and put the fire out. But the fire burned for 10 days. So during the course of that time, this radioactive material spread out all over Europe and ultimately encircled all of the northern hemisphere. Right. But they think now that really the whole helicopter operation, in which these pilots performed an extraordinary feat, was a total waste of time.
Yeah, you kind of conclude that was useless.
Yeah, and it went out on its own.
Yeah.
And then after that, they had to try and contain it by encapsulating the entire building in what they called the
talk about the sarcophagus. What was the sarcophagus?
Well, in the Soviet nuclear industry, they like to employ remediation chiefly by burying things in concrete.
Which isn't a terrible idea.
It's not a terrible idea, no.
It's a little hard to effectuate in this situation.
It is if the material is still extremely hot nuclear material, in which case you end up in a situation where the concrete appears to boil as you pour it on top of the stuff you're trying to cover up.
Right.
But so they spent, I think, it was complete by mid-November. They built this huge concrete, a new building, essentially, roofed with steel over the remains of reactor number 4.
Mikhail Gorbachev, was ushering actually a new era in the Soviet Union with glasnost and openness and perestroika. At the time, this didn't really fit into his game plan. But what role did it play in sort of unwinding the Soviet Union?
Well, I think that the sort of symbiotic role of Chernobyl in glasnost and in the unraveling the Soviet Union is quite complex. So I think the most compelling and interesting aspect of it is the effect it had on Gorbachev's own mindset. Mm-hmm. Because when he'd only come to power at the end of the previous year, yep, and he had made this speech at the Communist Party Congress, in which he'd aired these concepts of glasnost and perestroika, of openness and economic restructuring. Mm-hmm. But before the Chernobyl accident, they were just sort of slogans, and he hadn't really done anything about it, because he knew partly that he had to move slowly, because if he went too quickly, he could meet the same fate as Khrushchev, who was unseated because his compatriots thought in the Politburo thought that he was moving too fast.
But this was a test case of whether they would really be open and more responsive. And
well, a test case initially that he failed because he just took the traditional approach.
Right.
But what happened is that they did launch this inquiry into what had happened, and he was presented with the results in July of that year and realized to his horror that the system that he'd inherited was actually far more rotten than he had imagined. When he realized that the kind of rot from what he called the era of stagnation that preceded him, had reached even the heart of the nuclear industry, which was supposed to be this prestigious
pride and joy.
Exactly. Then he realized that he really had to move quickly, and if he was going to save, his idea was to save the Soviet Union through these reforms. Mm-hmm. But in moving quickly and in introducing economic reforms which weren't really that well thought out, if it was possible for them to have worked at all, they certainly weren't going to work if he plunged into them as deeply and as quickly as he did. And it's those reforms that ultimately led to the unraveling of the USSR. So I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of it.
Yeah, and how ultimately, obviously, the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine became independent. How did this figure in Ukraine's history in some way?
It was central to the push for Ukrainian independence, because the independent party that began to push for the breaking away of Ukraine from Moscow was the Green Party, was the Green World Party it was called. And so they made the ecology a kind of central plank of their platform. And because the whole of the nuclear industry around the USSR was all administered and imposed on the other states from Moscow, this was a kind of flashpoint in independence movements, both in Ukraine and in the Baltic states, for example. So the Chernobyl accident became a central example, a symbol of Moscow's, corrupting influence on Ukraine.
Yeah. So this accident, along with 3 Mile Island in the late 70s, really undoubtedly put a major crimp in plans for deeper nuclearization. You talk a little bit about the evolution of the industry, but was there potentially a different path for the industry where it could have become, because it is in an era of climate change, it's an alternative, maybe not a viable one. But do you think that particularly the way it's played out with the distrust it created around the industry and around the governments that were putting this in place, really made it almost impossible for the industry to sort of achieve the vision it had?
Well, I think that the problems with the nuclear electricity industry start right with its roots, which are bound up with
the weapon,
with nuclear weapons.
Right.
And so when you say could they have taken a different path? Yes, they could have done. And the path that would have been ideal is the one that people are embarking on now, which is to design nuclear reactors specifically to generate electricity, rather than adapting designs that were designed for military purposes. Right. Because all of the reactors that were built in the 50s and 60s, had military origin.
The electricity was basically a byproduct of the...
Well, in many
some
cases,
ways,
yeah. And literally, in the case of the reactor at Chernobyl, this was a military reactor. The initial design was based on military reactor designs which were designed to produce plutonium for atom weapons. And then they adapted it so that it could also make electricity. And then this was the one that at Chernobyl was a descendant of this design. Right. So, if they had embarked on a design process that prioritized electricity generation.
And put it in civilian hands, perhaps.
Yes, right? It could have been very different, I think.
You make an effort to try to assess the actual impact, in terms of death toll and shortened lives, but it's pretty hard to sort out exactly how many people died prematurely and all that. But how do you think about that today?
The honest answer is that we're never going to know, and that's partly because the Soviet government concealed a lot of data or failed to gather a lot of data in the first place, but also because the epidemiology of radiation exposure is so complicated. And so, people, when they think about the Chernobyl accident, are often sort of fixated on the potential death toll that was caused by radiation released from the explosion. And those figures are just sort of almost impossible to come up with. The best estimates that we have at this point are based on this work by an epidemiologist in France named Elizabeth Cardis, and she estimates that around 10,000 additional deaths from cancer will result from the radiation released in the accident, but that's in a population of 5 million people. So part of the problem is that the background level of cancer in the human population is so high, it's extremely hard to pick out the signal from the noise. But what we can say is that, the radiation has made a lot of people very sick. Aside from the deaths, the fatalities, the one cancer that can be very clearly linked to radiation release from Chernobyl is thyroid cancer. And at this point, there's 10 or 15,000 cases of thyroid cancer that have been caused as a result of Chernobyl. And while that isn't fatal, the treatment, which is very effective, is to remove your thyroid gland. And that, that does not make life easier for you afterwards. And so there are these other sicknesses that have been detected in the population at large, and especially among the liquidators who went in. They had 500,000 people eventually pass through the zone to try and clear it up. And they suffer from cataracts, they suffer from heart problems. So although they're not fatal, but they are deeply debilitating. And these things have affected, tens of thousands of people.
Just one last question before we run out of time. You describe it, it's a book I remember reading as a kid, I haven't picked it up in a long time, but A Night to Remember. Describe the parallels between the making and the sinking of the Titanic and how you found that. That was a bit of a model.
Oh, no, it was absolutely a model. Because I'd only read it like a couple of months before I went off to report this magazine story on Chernobyl, and I was explicitly inspired by it because it's a very brief book and it concentrates exclusively on the night of the accident. There's none of the preamble about, in other Titanic books you'll read about the long story of building the ship and all of these things that went wrong and all these kind of auguries of bad luck that took place. But for the magazine story, I had no intention of writing anything about the history of the Soviet nuclear industry. I was just going to, start at midnight on the night of the accident. And so it's extraordinary in that respect because it's so concise and so powerful. And the fact that although obviously you know what's going to happen in the end, it's still incredibly gripping. But the parallels are definitely there in that it's rooted in this overconfidence, hubris, and confidence in high technology being a sort of panacea for everything. And just as the Edwardians in England thought of steamship travel as being a harbinger of this fantastic high-tech future, so the Soviets thought of nuclear energy.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.